May 25th, 2026. These are the most important stories since yesterday. In governance, the White House secretly requested $9 billion to buy Grace Blackwell chips for classified intelligence systems, and the NSA finalized an Anthropic contract that dropped a clause limiting its AI use to lawful purposes. In tech, Huawei announced it will reach 1.4 nanometer chip production by 2031 using a proprietary technique it is calling LogicFolding, built to sidestep the advanced lithography equipment that the U.S. export controls had been designed to deny it. In governance, Pope Leo released Magnifica Humanitas, the first papal encyclical on AI, calling for international regulation and warning that private transnational power has grown beyond what most governments can govern. In AI, the most effective frontier model jailbreaks have shifted from prompt syntax to psychological manipulation, with attackers now using emotional reciprocity and roleplay to exploit how models construct their own identity. In medicine, ASCO 2026 delivers a landmark week of pivotal Phase 3 cancer immunotherapy readouts spanning liver, bladder, pancreatic, myeloma, and localized prostate cancer, among the most closely watched trials of the year. In governance, Scotland's National Green Data Centres policy has no working definition of what green means and was written before generative AI existed, yet it now governs more than a dozen AI-era facility applications with those same gaps intact. In energy, nuclear startup Deep Fission filed for a $157 million NASDAQ IPO at $24 to $26 per share, its second attempt to go public, after a 2025 SPAC deal that never produced tradable stock. In labor, robots are now preparing meals at a San Francisco nonprofit serving the Tenderloin, where Project OpenHand deployed automation to fill a structural volunteer shortage rather than displace workers. Deeper dives on all of this are in today's Century Report, and many are discussed further in today's podcast. Links to both are in the description, or head on over to thecenturyreport.com. Or if you're already here on the podcast, let's get into it now. The White House sent Congress a secret $9 billion request for NVIDIA Grace Blackwell chips. The buyer is the U.S. intelligence community. The CIA and NSA cannot run current frontier AI models on their classified networks. The chips do not exist on the secure side at the scale that the work now requires. Another $800 million is already being reprogrammed to start the build-out immediately. Amazon Web Services runs most of the classified cloud. AWS announced a $50 billion upgrade last year. Even that has not closed the gap. The money is just one layer. The deeper move is what the same reporting put on the record. White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles authorized the NSA to keep using Anthropic Mythos. A classified NSA-Anthropic contract is being finalized. Crucially, the contract drops the any lawful use clause that the Pentagon spent 3 months trying to force into it starting back in February. It adds a carve-out, preventing the model from running on Americans' data. The New York Times reports the White House wants this contract to be the template for other AI vendors. So stay on this part for a moment. In February, the Pentagon designated Anthropic a supply chain risk. The reasoning was that a vendor refusing certain operations was a vendor whose values are contaminating procurement. And 3 months later, a different part of the executive branch reached a different conclusion. The civilian intelligence agencies are barred by charter from operations against Americans on U.S. soil. Anthropic's red lines fit that charter. The same limits the Pentagon called contamination became the contract architecture that the White House now wants to scale. So what does this mean for you in really practical terms? It means the safety architecture frontier labs have been building into their models for years has become the procurement standard that the U.S. national security apparatus is now writing into its template contracts. The interpretability translation layer that Anthropic published earlier this month is part of the technical infrastructure that lets those contracts be enforced. The work of making AI commitments verifiable just became a procurement requirement at the level of the intelligence community. A deeper look at this is in today's edition on the website if you want to check it out. The clip shortage is what made this possible. Capability at the frontier has become scarce enough that the safety reads as leverage rather than as overhead. Once the buyer's own charter aligns with the limits, the model carries. The CIA and NSA needed Mythos to keep working on the classified side. They have it on terms very close to the ones Anthropic refused to abandon under the Pentagon pressure. The $9 billion, that is the visible number. The contract template, that's the structural one. Okay, let's shift away to another story here. Huawei's semiconductor chief, He Tingbo, said in a rare public appearance this week that the company will produce 1.4 nanometer chips by 2031. The technique she named is proprietary. Huawei calls it LogicFolding. TSMC plans to begin mass production of the same node in 2028. So the gap is 3 years. The gap the U.S. export control architecture was designed to enforce was closer to 5 years and widening rather than closing. He Tingbo's statement collapses that planning assumption. A reminder of how the export regime was built. In 2019 and 2022, the United States persuaded the Netherlands and Japan to deny the ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment to Chinese chip makers. The premise was simple. The lithography step is the binding constraint on frontier chip production. Cut off the equipment, cut off the pathway. Huawei is now publicly committed to engineering around the equipment. LogicFolding gets to advanced nodes through structural and process innovations rather than the single lithography step that the EUV machines perform. The technical content of LogicFolding is not public in detail, but the strategic content is. The substitution path the export regime assumed would stay closed is being publicly described as one that Huawei intends to engineer open. Now let's pair this with the lead story just above. The intelligence community of the country that wrote the chip export regime is short on the chips that the regime was supposed to keep flowing to it. The country the regime was designed to constrain has now named its pathway to closing the fabrication gap from the other side. Two halves of one story. Will LogicFolding deliver on the 2031 timeline? That's an open question. 2031 is 6 years out. The answer requires fabs to be built, equipment to work, yields to come up. But a reasonable read of the announcement itself is that companies do not name a specific node and a specific year publicly from a stage unless internal progress is far enough along that the date can survive scrutiny. What is no longer an open question then is whether the planning assumption underneath the export regime, the capability concentration that produces durability, describes the trajectory that the chip industry is actually on. All right, let's shift away again here. Pope Leo released the Magnifica Humanitas today, a 43,000-word encyclical, the first papal encyclical on artificial intelligence. The Vatican launched it with Anthropic interpretability researcher Christopher Olah on the stage alongside the pontiff. And here is the central passage, quoting here. The main drivers of development are private, often transnational, parties endowed with resources and the capacity to intervene that surpass those of many governments. Let's close the quote there. The institution making this argument speaks to 1.4 billion members. It has been formalizing moral frameworks for industrial transitions since 1891. The specific governance asks are very concrete. International regulation to slow AI deployment in domains touching public goods and fundamental rights. Data ownership not left solely to private hands. Lethal or otherwise irreversible decisions not entrusted to artificial systems. The development and the use of AI in warfare subject to most rigorous ethical constraints. A direct naming of the link between economic interests, the military apparatus, and political decisions producing a posture in which war appears as a natural extension of politics. What the encyclical does, that conventional regulatory commentary cannot, is put on the public record a statement that power capable of reshaping civilization is concentrating in private hands, whose accountability architecture predates the capability that they now wield. The same week, Cannes registered the creative industry split on AI from the top, as we talked about yesterday. Darren Aronofsky announced the active partnership with Google DeepMind on generative film projects, while Guillermo del Toro said he would rather die than use AI in filmmaking. Also, Demi Moore on this year's competition jury said that AI is here and fighting it is a losing battle. The Vatican is the most institutionally durable moral authority in the West. Cannes is the most visible platform in global cinema. Both put positions on the record this week. The moral framework for the AI era is really being written during the transition rather than after it by institutions that have been doing this kind of work for quite a long time. So what's the question here is whether the moral and cultural authorities that the prior era invented for the industrial transitions would speak to this transition with comparable seriousness. Today is part of that answer. The encyclical is now on the public record, and 1.4 billion people have a frame for the question that their pontiff has placed at the center of the era. Shifting away again here. The architecture of how AI systems get broken open is shifting under the discipline built to defend them. The Verge laid this out this week. The first generation of jailbreaks was syntactic. Ignore all previous instructions, the Dan roleplay frame, the grandma exploit that got napalm synthesis instructions by asking the model to roleplay a negligent grandmother telling bedtime stories about flammable chemistry. The fixes shipped fast. The vulnerability underneath them did not close, though. What has replaced syntactic jailbreaking is harder. The most effective current attacks are simple conversation. Slow, built around the model's constructed personality. Hackers steer a session through flattery and gaslighting. They use role-play scaffolding. They appeal to the model's stated sense of self. The refusal posture loosens through extended interaction. MindGuard's recent work demonstrated this against Claude. The firm described the techniques as closer to psychology than to computer science. The same warmth and helpfulness that make these systems useful are now the surface attackers exploit. You cannot patch personality the way that you patch a buffer overflow. The trait being attacked is the trait that users value most. What this opens up is a new class of AI security work where the most valuable skills are linguistic and psychological rather than technical. The professionals doing red team work on frontier systems increasingly resemble interrogators and screenwriters more than penetration testers. The defensive response has to operate in the same register. Interpretability research, framed for years as an alignment question, now functions as active cyber defense. The translation layer between a model's internal state and human-readable description that Anthropic published earlier this month is part of the infrastructure letting defenders see what the conversational attack is exploiting. There's also a talent door widening here that the discipline previously did not know how to read. Linguists, narrative writers, conversation analysts, therapists. The field that already understands relational dynamics at depth are exactly the fields that the frontier security stack now needs. The attack surface widening is the same as the talent door widening in this case. Yesterday's edition covered Project Glasswing's first-month scoreboard, Mythos finding more than 10,000 vulnerability candidates in critical open-source software, 97 already patched upstream. The defensive capability is compounding. The discipline organizing the response is widening to include people that the security industry did not previously hire. Both layers are moving while the attack vector itself migrates. Shifting away once again here, the flagship Oncology Congress, ASCO or ASCO, runs at the end of this month. The late breaker slate is unusually dense, so let me walk you through what's queued because the convergence itself, that's the news. AstraZeneca will report Emerald-3, pushing the durvalumab and the tremelimumab combination into first-line hepatocellular carcinoma. The first major attempt to displace the 6 to 10 month recurrence window that has anchored liver cancer treatment for a decade. The same company will also read out Potomac, which is extending durvalumab from muscle-invasive into non-muscle-invasive bladder cancer, which is a setting where BCG induction has been the only standard of care since the 1970s. Revolution Medicines will present Resolute 302 in metastatic pancreatic cancer. Daraxonrasib already cut death risk 60% in earlier data. Resolute opens the broader pan-RAS class to second-line pancreatic disease, a disease that has resisted targeted therapy for 40 years. Bristol-Myers Squibb's mezigdomide reads out in Successor 2, first phase 3 data for the CELMoD platform built to succeed Revlimid and Pomalyst as those drugs face generic competition. Johnson & Johnson's Proteus opens the plenary with upalutamide, which is moving into high-risk localized prostate cancer, the largest patient population in the entire disease. Pfizer's Talipro-3 brings the PARP class into earlier stage castration-sensitive prostate cancer. So that's a whole lot of big words, but suffice it to say that they are moving forward on a whole lot of different fronts in cancer, and they're meeting today at the conference to speak about this and present what they've come up with so far. So that is a series of 6 pivotal phase 3 readouts queued for a single week across hepatocellular, bladder, pancreatic, myeloma, and 2 distinct prostate populations. What the convergence describes here, then, is the platform structure of oncology shifting at trial pace. The chemotherapy paradigm that organized cancer treatment for 60 years assumed that every tumor type needed its own protocol and its own drug. The trials reading out at ASCO target the same disease with checkpoint inhibitors, PARP enzyme, RAS family blockers, cereblon modulators, and androgen receptor inhibitors, molecular platforms tested simultaneously across disease boundaries that the prior paradigm treated as separate problems. Eric Topol's recent synthesis catalogs this proliferation underneath antibody-drug conjugates, bispecific T-cell engagers, CAR-T, CAR-NK, T-cell engagers, trispecific T-cell engagers. All of these are maturing in parallel. So if you or someone you love is currently facing one of these cancers, what reads out at ASCO this year may be the data that moves your treatment options before the next time you see your oncologist. The compression of the timeline between trial readout and standard of care adoption has been accelerating across the field. It's not tomorrow, but it is accelerating. The Arc the Century report has been tracking under scientific and medical timeline compression has the next major data drop on a calendar measured in single ASCO seasons, rather than decade-long approval cycles. So let's bring it to a close today. What Today put on the record reaches back to 1891. That was the year of the Rerum Novarum, which was the first papal encyclical addressing industrial labor and the moral economy of the factory era. The Vatican wrote it as the world was reorganizing around steam and steel. Today, Pope Leo released Magnifica Humanitas, addressed to artificial intelligence on the 135th anniversary of that document. That alone tells you how monumental artificial intelligence is. The institution that named the moral structure of the prior industrial transition just named the moral structure of this one. It did so by saying that the actors driving development have resources and capacity that surpass those of many governments, and that the accountability architecture for that kind of power has to be built during the transition rather than after it. The same news cycle carried the conditions that made the question impossible to defer. The intelligence community of the country that built the chip export regime accepted Frontier Labs safety commitments as the procurement template that it had previously called contamination. The country those export controls were built to constrain put a date on closing the fabrication gap from the other side. The cancer treatment paradigm of the past 60 years began reorganizing in Phase 3 readouts that publish next week. The cybersecurity discipline started rebuilding itself around language and psychology because the attack surface migrated there. These are the evidence that the question Leo raised is now the central one. You are inside the build. You are living inside this transition, possibly the greatest transition in human history. The work of writing the accountability architecture for this era is happening now. In encyclicals, in procurement specifications, in clinical trial protocols, in red team rooms staffed by people the security industry had not previously thought to hire. The instruments are arriving in your hands. The architecture around them is being written by people who can see the capability shipping in front of them. That is what Today put on the record. We'll see you tomorrow.